Hello! So today we're going to be doing some palm trees with clouds. So with this I'm going to be using a Mono 0 pen for inking. This one is a size 5 just because it's running out of ink, so it's great for thinner lines. Typically I use an 01, but when I'm drawing directly onto Arches paper, I tend to like to use a little bit bigger nib. And then I have a large round brush, which this is an 18, but you can always use, like this one's a 12, it's around the same size. So just a large round brush and a smaller round brush for some of our details. So, and before, we even start thinking about clouds, what I want to do first is I have a big piece of paper divided in half with a piece of tape. One side's going to be my practice and the other side will be my final. Of course, you may end up loving the practice more than the other one, so it doesn't really matter. You could also have like a whole sheet and then another whole sheet for practice. That's up to you. But what I'm going to do first is draw my palm trees onto my paper. So if I'm drawing straight onto watercolor paper, I would want to very lightly draw with pencil first, starting with the trunk. And the trunk we want to get a little skinnier as it goes up. And then from the trunk, we have the palm fronds. And typically you want them to kind of curve out a little bit, some that are kind of flopped over, and then some that are sticking upwards. So almost like a firework shape. So, and then I could draw two, so it's not boring. And typically we want to do things in odd numbers, so I could always put maybe one that's cut off a little bit over here for interest. But if you don't want to do it in pencil first, you could totally start off with ink. The important thing with ink is you want to make sure you're looking at where you're going, not where you're coming from. And then for the palm fronds, they have like one center line and then little lines that flick off from them. Like that. And I'm just going to do this really quickly. So you can flick sometimes to make them, or you can very, very slowly kind of decide exactly where you want them. But you don't want to get too caught up with making them exactly the same that they look too man-made. So it's good to kind of have some that are distinct and some that are kind of flicked in. And then next what we're going to do is we're going to be practicing our sky. So there's a lot of different sky techniques you can use that work just as well. So if you have a sky technique you prefer, you can always use that. I really like the wet on wet method. And that's basically where you wet the paper, then you take blue and you drop it in around where you want your clouds to be. So you can also combine it with lifting by using a Kleenex to kind of lift, and I'll show y'all how to do that as well. So, but first thing I want to do is load my brush with a little water, not super dripping wet unless it was a really big piece of paper. I want to drag it a little bit, and I'm going to do water all over my paper. And sometimes if you tilt your head, you can see where on your paper it's shiny. And I just want it, a light sheen everywhere. If you see a really big puddle, probably let it dry a little bit before you start on the blue. Now, I'm going to prep some ultramarine blue. Okay, so ultramarine blue is a really pretty and soft blue, and that's why I like it for clouds. You could always use cobalt or something similar, and that'll give you kind of the desired color, or you can do whatever color you want. So, but I have a nice puddle of blue, and also I'm going to prep blue and a little burnt sienna. And I'm not worried too much about my paper drying just because it was really wet. I probably would do this step before you wet your paper, just so it doesn't dry on you, which may have a little bit on me. So I'm going to take my blue now, and I'm going to be painting with the side of the tip around where I want my clouds to go. And if my palm trees were down here, I wouldn't want very much blue because we're actually painting them on top of the sky. And if my paper has dried a little bit, I can always use some water to kind of soften the edges a little bit. Like that. And then while it's wet, I can take a little gray and put in my shadow. And the shadow is basically like a smaller version of your cloud shape. And let's say I overdid it and I lost a lot of my white. Well, I can take a Kleenex and tap a little bit like that, and that's gonna lift some of my cloud shape up. You can also lift out smaller clouds like that. You just want to make sure that you don't tap over and over again when you're lifting. Just kind of tap a little bit. So now what we're going to do is we're going to work on this again. So I'm going to again take just the water. This time I'm going to start from the bottom and go up. And I'm going to take my blue, and this time it's very wet, and I'm painting around my cloud shapes. Typically you want your clouds to be bigger up top and smaller at the bottom. Of course I have kind of the opposite, and that's okay. And if this was a little small, I can just lift out with my Kleenex a little bit. Just like that. And I'm going to add a little bit of gray. Not too much though, because again, you want our palm trees to show up really well. Just like that. All right, and then if I got a little heavy with the paint, I can lift up a little bit where my palm trees are. Awesome. And we'll just have to let that dry a little bit, and then we'll start layering in with our colors on our palm. All right, so while this one is drying, I can go ahead and sketch out my palm trees on this one. Of course, this is all dependent on if it's dry. If it's not dry, don't try and hurriedly put it in. I would kind of blow dry it or put it to the side until you have time to work on it. So, it's fairly dry. I can go ahead and just sketch out my little palm trees. Mine's still a little too wet probably, but we're gonna go with it. There. Maybe I'll do one over here. Like the edge. Okay. And I can very carefully add some ink. So, and if you wanted to add a little bit of shading, I would put like a little bit of hatching lines, like little dashes on one side of your tree trunk for like a shadow. Versus like, you know, the leaves, I could probably do all the same. Sometimes I'll go back and make one side a little darker but you don't want your inking to be too heavy or else you won't really be able to do very much with them. You know, like the yellow won't show up as much is what I mean. And of course, you don't have to practice your sky only 1 or 2 times. I would practice as many times until you feel comfortable with it. Because it has taken me, you know, lots and lots of practice to get to the point where I'm happy with my clouds. Because especially with the wet on wet technique, it's a little bit abstract and you don't necessarily know exactly what's going to happen with your clouds. Because it's a little unpredictable. So, now that I have these sketched out, because this is still my practice paper, but it was a little more dry than my final paper. We want to think about how with your palm trees, you know, there's a lot of yellows and greens and browns to them, but if I try and put all those in at the same time, it's going to get really muddy. So I have to practice layering. So what that means is first, we're going to prepare some lemon yellow on our palette. And lemon yellow is going to look very bright. Mine's a little dirty. So I'm going to take some from my well, put it over here, add some water to it. And on all of my little palm trees, I'm going to go ahead and do a light coat. So you don't have to keep it like a coloring book where it's only where the leaves are. We want to keep them pretty close though. But if I go really outside the lines, I could always just add more ink. I'm just doing a light coat with my smaller brush. And it's a very light layer. So that means I have a decent amount of water, but it's not so wet that it's not showing through. And it won't be really bright yellow just because there is a little bit of green since we're layering on top of blue or even gray. So I can do the same thing on the other side, letting the one side dry. If you want to make it a little more distinct, you could flick with your inking. That's what we'll do when we do the green layer. Great. And then while we're letting this layer dry, I want to do a light layer on my trunks. So I'm going to take a color that's called burnt sienna. It's kind of like a terracotta brown, like this. And again, we're not trying to go very dark. So I'm going to take a little bit and do a very light coat on my trunk. So if your yellow is so sopping wet, or it's really close to your branches, I would probably wait on this layer and do it when the yellow's a bit more dry. Oops. And if that happens, I can take a slightly wet brush and lift, kind of like this. Ta-da! And I'm going to go ahead and do my layer over here. Ta-da! Great. And of course, this layer you really want to dry. We don't want to get in a hurry because, you know, the paint will still be there. But I'm going to talk a little bit about greens while this is drying. So I have a very large palette with a lot of different greens. Kind of a good green to use a lot of times is sap green. And you can kind of see it already has a lot of yellow to it. So if your sap green is a little too olive for palm trees, then I could always take a bit of my ultramarine blue and add it to my green. So this will be like my first layer of green, and then I'll have green with even less water and a little more blue. Like that. So, and then with the two greens, basically what I have to do is layer it. So layering is basically where I'm not trying to cover the layer I did previously. I'm trying to let like this yellow show through a good amount without covering it all over. So this is my lighter green. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to flick in the direction of my inking I did. Flick, flick. But I'm not covering the yellow. The yellow is kind of like our underpainting or undercolor. See? And I would just go around each of those little spots. Go around like that. And you just keep going until all of them are green. All right, and then I've gone ahead and done that same green on my final one over here. So this one is about dry now. So I can go ahead and work on the second layer. So I don't have to do this darker green everywhere on my palm trees. I can actually just focus on like maybe this palm leaf is coming down a bit more, so I want it darker. Or maybe if one of the palm leaves, palm fronds, are behind another, like back here, I could make that one darker. So you don't have to do it all over. You know, start off slow, less is more. We can always add more, but you can't really take it away. Because in watercolor, you can't really make things lighter. Unless you have a white paint pen. Then sometimes you can. So I can add some with my green. And you don't want to get in a rush, like right here, because then it kind of becomes just one shape. So I want to try and do them like individual little fronds. And sometimes you'll get a little bit of what's called dry brushing. So that means when I'm starting to run out of paint, like on this one, I was starting to run out of paint and then it creates dry brushing, which is actually kind of fun. It's just basically like if I tapped off my paintbrush while I had paint on it and I'm barely using any water, it'll give you that dry brush effect where it's kind of rough. And then probably the last thing we want to do is go back to using burnt sienna and adding another layer to one side of my tree for like a shadow. And also, if you look at palm trees in real life, a lot of times they have a little bit of brown. Sometimes it's because a palm frond is dying, but it just adds a tad bit of realism to them. So I can just layer some brown on top of some places. Or, let's say I don't think my green is bright enough. You can even layer over with yellow. See, it just brightens up the whole thing. So I hope y'all enjoy making palm trees in watercolor. You can always add little details like birds, an airplane in the sky, but the most important thing is to keep practicing and keep painting.